We have concluded the disadvantages are such that we do not support a graduate tax. So said Lord Deering in his landmark review of higher education or HE funding in 1997, shortly before tuition fees were first introduced. Over a decade later, Lord Browne's review of HE funding in 2010 also rejected calls for a graduate tax, before going on to propose a significant uplift in tuition fees. Here we are, over a decade on from the Browne review, and yet again a graduate tax is being proposed by some commentators as the solution to the financial woes facing the HE sector, particularly as opposition to the current student loan system grows by the day. A graduate tax would essentially mean that rather than a graduate paying back the cost of their HE course through student loan repayments when they are in work, graduates would instead pay an extra tax on top of their income tax, and these extra payments would depend purely on their income level rather than the actual cost of their HE course. So, what makes a graduate tax look appealing relative to a student loan system? Would students, universities, and the government be better or worse off if a graduate tax was implemented? And crucially, do the reasons that led to a graduate tax being rejected in the past still hold true today? My guests are Professor John Blake, Director of the Post-18 Project, and Jonathan Simons, a partner and head of the education practice at Public First. I'm Tom Richmond, and to figure out if a graduate tax is the future solution to the current problems with student loans, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
John, the troubles in our student loan system are causing a lot of people to ask whether there is a better alternative out there in terms of how we fund HE in England. So, first things first, why are so many people unhappy with the student loan system at the moment?
So I think there are two distinct constituencies that it's worth knowing about. One is the graduates themselves. So in the past few weeks and months, we've heard an enormous amount from people in their late 20s, early 30s who are holding what are called Plan 2 loans. So that's people who went after 2012. You borrowed about £9,000 a year for your fees, plus the extra for your maintenance, and you would pay that back over 30 years, be cancelled at the end of the 30 years, and there was a threshold that you didn't pay if you were earning below that threshold. But crucially, you got charged interest of RPI plus 3%. What they are complaining about is that as a result of the high inflation that we've experienced in the years since, that interest is accumulating in a way that means that they are never going to pay the loan off. So that the total amount of money that they're likely to pay back will never exceed the amount that is topping up each year in their student loans account. And many people have been drawn into repayment in a way that was not originally envisaged because the threshold that you start paying at has been frozen. So it's now functionally only just above the London living wage, whereas originally there was sort of implied to be a period of time in your early career where you wouldn't be paying back at all, at least for a couple of years. So both of those have eroded quite considerably, and people feel the terms of that are not fair, and it turns out to be sort of psychologically quite crushing to be seeing the amount that you owe going up continuously and continuously. The problem is there's a second group of people who are also looking at the system and think that there are wider and deeper problems in terms of the actual funding available for higher education. So the tuition fee, which forms the majority of the government's funding for HE, was frozen for a decade and has meant that HE has been steadily receiving less money per student and things like that. So there's a problem with the actual underlying funding of the system that's slightly distinct from but related to this problem with graduates feeling upset about the terms on which they are repaying.
Okay, so we've got some unhappy graduates and potentially some unhappy universities too. So in that context, I guess it's not surprising that some people are now pointing towards a graduate tax as a way to resolve some or potentially all of these concerns. The Browne Review in 2010 did accept that a graduate tax, quote, has some attractive features. So, Jonathan, what are these features of a graduate tax that have helped reignite interest in this idea, given all the criticism of student loans that John has set out?
So I think there's 4 reasons why people like a graduate tax, at least superficially. The first of which, and probably the most important, is it is not a debt. People are very psychologically upset by the concept of a debt, an amount they owe, whereas a tax liability in future years isn't a debt. People accept that they are taxed on their income, but there's not an amount of money that grows or shrinks. And so a graduate tax takes away that language of borrowing, of loans, of debt, and that's very attractive to a lot of people. The second reason people like it, although this tends to be people who are sort of much more in the weeds of things, is that there are aspects of the current student loan repayment system which are regressive, which is to say that middle earners are at the moment projected to pay back higher amounts than high earners. And that's because, as John said, of the interest rate. So in other words, if you are paying back a large amount of money per month because you are earning a very high salary, you are running ahead of the interest rate. If you're a middle earner, you're not running ahead of the interest rate. So the total amount you pay back is greater. And again, people don't like that regressive aspect of it. The third aspect is, as John said, the interest rate. People feel very, very annoyed that they are paying back in real terms more than they borrowed. And you avoid that with the tax system because you just are taxed on what you earn. And the fourth aspect, and this is by far and away the smallest aspect, but it's nonetheless an issue for some people. At the moment, about 10% of students don't take out any student loans because they pay their fees up front. This is, unsurprisingly, almost exactly the same as the proportion of people who go to independent schools, because independent school fees at about £30,000 a year, actually going to university and paying your fees up front is still cheaper than paying independent school sixth form fees. So about 10% of people don't pay fees. And they then obviously don't get caught in this student debt trap. If you had a pure graduate tax, you would not be allowed to pay fees up front. You would be taxed exactly the same. And at least for some people, it's quite attractive to not have the richest 10% of people escape a debt trap.
Okay, so that's 4 reasons to look favourably at a graduate's tax, particularly when student loans are getting such a bad press. However, the Browne Review ultimately rejected a graduate tax in favour of our tuition fees and loans model that we have now. So let's dig into their reasoning to see what you both make of the arguments against a graduate tax both then and now. First up is the not insignificant question of whether we could actually introduce a graduate tax at all, because the Browne Review declared it to be, in their words, unworkable. The main reason for this was that graduates would, of course, only start paying a graduate tax after finishing their course. But the current student loan system sends money straight to universities and other HE providers while a student is studying. So a graduate tax would risk creating a 3-year black hole where somebody would have to keep paying HE providers, but the government won't be getting any money back from graduates. The Browne Review even claimed it would take 30 years before a graduate tax became revenue neutral for the government, because it would be a very long time before enough graduates were paying enough tax to cover the costs of the HE system. Jonathan, the Browne Review felt that this funding gap was enough to make the whole concept of a graduate tax unworkable. Was that the right conclusion?
Yes, it was completely the right conclusion. I think it was H.L. Mencken that said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And a graduate tax absolutely falls into this category. As you say, there are various different estimates. So Browne said it's 30 years. I think DFE, or DFES, as it was when they last looked at this, said it was 20 years. Even the National Union of Students said it was 16 years gap. That is not to be underestimated as, essentially, in my view, a drop-dead reason why you can't do this. Because, as you say, it is not just the simple fact that one cohort of students have to be paid for 3 years before they then graduate. It's that successive cohorts of students are only paying back a relatively small amount of tax early in their career. And to essentially say to the Exchequer, and indeed to other taxpayers, that the entire burden of funding the higher education system falls on graduate taxpayers for essentially a generation, I think is completely impossible to deliver. And the effect would obviously be that funding for higher education would fall very dramatically, not for 1 year or for 2 years, but as I say, for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. And that seems to be an absolutely drop-dead reason why you can't have a pure graduate tax.
John, what do you make of this issue of a funding gap? What's your perspective?
I think it is an accounting trick that is best ignored and avoided, in the sense that the situation that Jonathan has just described is exactly what happens now. The government funds higher education directly through underwriting the loans that are provided by the student loans company, and it doesn't receive money from those people until such time as they are repaying their loans. So the fundamental architecture is identical. It is just described differently in the government's books. Now, that is enormously convenient for the government in all sorts of ways, not least is the fact that loans weirdly appear as an asset for the government rather than a loss in all sorts of odd ways. But it is fundamentally an accounting trick. It doesn't speak to the underlying reality of where the money is coming from or where it is going. I don't underestimate that there is some significant technical detail that we need to work through to deal with that. But I think it's no more nor less technocratic than the system that we currently have. And I think the deleterious impacts of the current system are sufficient to justify doing that work.
Okay, very interesting. The next criticism of a graduate tax in the Browne Review was on the matter of student choice, because increasing student choice was absolutely central to the tuition fee and loan model that the Browne Review supported and we've subsequently seen implemented. The review complained at the time that no HE providers could grow in response to student demand because there were student number caps back then. So the review's proposals aimed to, quote, put students at the heart of the system, with popular providers being able to expand to meet demand. And it's those choices by students which will, quote, shape the landscape of higher education. However, in the review's mind, a graduate tax, quote, weakens the role of student choice, because the money no longer directly follows the student, unlike a tuition fee, and thus the tax removes student choice as a key driver of better quality provision. John, the review was convinced that student choice was the key mechanism for driving up quality in HE, and a graduate tax would remove this mechanism. What do you make of those two lines of argument?
So how do you feel that student choice is doing in driving quality in the higher education system now? I think fundamentally it's one of those arguments that's extraordinarily attractive and feels innately correct right until the moment you look at any of the evidence and you're like, oh no, that didn't work at all. In the first place, Browne did not put students at the heart of the system. Students have never been at the heart of the higher education system. Insofar as a student-like person is at the heart of the system, it is the aspirant student at the heart, because it's about persuading the students who want to go into higher education to come to your institution. So the people who are actually being targeted are, by and large, sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are thinking about going. So one of the things that you do see in this current system is, for a system driven by student choice, lots of students are remarkably unhappy with some of the things that they experience in higher education, in particular, their accommodation, their working hours, the level of support they get for their course and things like that. So it clearly hasn't driven quality in the sense of the eyes of the student. It hasn't particularly driven quality in terms of improving standards of teaching and learning. And again, that's not a surprise because it's not really connected to doing that. As students or aspirant students are not particularly well placed to judge that. And it hasn't particularly increased alignment with the labour market if your chosen metric for success is that the graduates should be highly successful and highly paid in the subsequent graduate labour market. In fact, lots of the courses that we have seen grow as a result of the release of student number controls, including certain business courses and computer science courses, have been demonstrated to be extraordinarily low returns. What they have in common is that you can rack 'em high, teach 'em cheap, and put a lot of people in a room and teach them that thing, and that the title of the course sounds like it should be economically viable. You know, who wouldn't want to be a computer scientist in the age of AI and the new future? But actually, the course wasn't particularly good for training you to do that. Most of the things the Browne Review led to, for example, taking off the student number controls, saw enormous increases in the size of institutions without any increase in quality, and indeed with actual substantial problems. So the government is currently dealing with a massive growth of franchising courses where there appears to be considerable levels of, at best, poor quality, at worst, some cases of actual fraud. The whole show is absolutely not what was promised by Browne or indeed by the Deering system before it.
Jonathan, looking back on it now, what do you make of the review's vision for tuition fees driving up quality through greater choice for students? Because if it hasn't really happened in practice as John describes, then doesn't a graduate tax start to look more appealing?
I mean, this argument makes me very sad, actually, because I agree with John and I wish I didn't. Just before I left government in 2010, so just after the coalition government had come in, and obviously the coalition government had received the Browne report, which was commissioned by the outgoing Labour government. Obviously, of course, infamously, this led to the Lib Dems agreeing to the tripling of tuition fees and the acceptance of some of the Browne Review recommendations and not the others. And I will always remember being in a meeting room in the Cabinet Office with various coalition-era ministers where we were talking about essentially the variable fee structure, what then turned into £9,000 fees. And the discussion was, would a system of variable fees actually be created? If you took away the sort of previous cap of £3,000 and you had a maximum of £9,000, would that create a market? And I will always remember that the very, very firm view of everybody in the room, including myself, was that it would create a market in variable fees. And the feeling was that Oxford, Cambridge, a handful of others would immediately move up to the maximum, but that the vast majority of institutions simply wouldn't be able to price at that level because it was just not going to be something where they would get sufficient student demand. So you would suddenly create a variable price market. Now, the Conservatives in that room thought it was a great idea. The Liberal Democrats in the room thought it was a terrible idea. But everybody thought that it would happen. And of course, as we all know, with I think one single exception in year one of one university that charged something like £8,800, every single university went straight up to the maximum. And why did they do so? In retrospect, two incredibly obvious reasons why. The first of which is that, of course, the student loan system pays up to the maximum. So if you are going to borrow a vast amount of money, why not just borrow a little bit more money? There is essentially no difference between borrowing 3 years' worth of tuition fees at £6,000 versus 3 years of tuition fees at £9,000. They're both vast sums of money. At the time you're 16 or 17 or 18, to the extent you understand the system, you're going to be paying it back over years. You might as well borrow up to the maximum and go to a high-ranked university. And the second reason, again, obviously in retrospect, is the minute that you charge a lower price, you look cheap. You look a worse quality outfit. If Oxford and Cambridge and UCL and LSE are charging £9,000 and the University of East Rutland is charging £6,000 or £4,000, any prospective student is quite reasonably going to go, why are you doing that? Are you only half as good? Do I only get half as much stuff? Is an employer going to value my degree half as much? If that's true, well, I'll just go up to the £9,000 institutions, particularly if the student loan system allows me to do so. So it is obvious in retrospect that a student choice market, in the way we structured it in the time post-Browne, was never going to work. And so I wholly agree with John. The one area in which I do disagree, I think we have had some element of student choice at course level. John talked about growth of business studies, talked about growth of computer science. I mean, that is an aspect of student choice. We might not find it a desirable one, but those courses have grown as a result of student choice. Those are now the biggest courses, or certainly business and management is the biggest course in UK undergraduate education at the moment. Now, we might say that's because students have rationally chosen it. We might say it's because they've rationally but incorrectly chosen it. We might say it's because universities have marketed it because you could rack it high and sell it cheap. But it has been an aspect of student choice. That market has grown because we now give students complete choice over which course and which university they want to go to, assuming they've got the qualifications.
Well, it wasn't only student choice that the Browne Review was concerned about weakening with a graduate tax. The review was also worried that the graduate tax would, quote, weaken institutional autonomy because universities and other HE providers would in future be reliant on central government for their funding, not the student loan system. And it is not guaranteed, and possibly even unlikely, that all the money raised by a graduate tax would be hypothecated, as in reserved for higher education, rather than ending up being spent on something else like the NHS. Jonathan, the current student loan system is almost entirely reserved for HE courses, so no other part of government can really get its hands on the available funding. But a graduate tax would be a very different proposition if all the money goes to central government and they decide how it's spent. How strong an argument do you think that is against a graduate tax?
So for me, this is the other deal-breaking argument. It seems to me absolutely axiomatic that a system of general taxation would be worse off for higher education institutions than the current hypothecated system of student fees. And the reason in which I say that is because there are two proof points that show this to be true. The first of which is Home Office visas, and the second of which is the further education system. So the further education system is almost entirely dependent on government largesse. There are some employer-funded courses and so on and so forth, but for the vast majority, particularly 16 to 18-year-olds going into FE, you are entirely dependent on government largesse. And what has happened? FE funding has fallen off a cliff because it is fundamentally not as popular as other things you can spend money on. And whilst that remains the case, it's always going to be second or third or fourth or fifth or 10th in the pecking order. And higher education is in exactly the same place. Every single piece of polling we've done on higher education in the last couple of years shows that higher education has fallen off a cliff in terms of public perception and social licence. And that means that any chancellor, Labour, Conservative, Reform, Green, Liberal Democrat, everyone is going to look to push down funding for higher education. Universities who want a graduate tax are essentially, I'm afraid, conniving in their own death and destruction. The second reason it won't work, and the second proof point, is Home Office visas. If you look at the amount of effort and nervousness universities go into around the visas for international students, which are entirely in the gift of the Home Office. So that's not an aspect of student choice. You don't have free rein as to how many international students you can hire. That's entirely dependent on them getting visas. The universities are obsessed with the Home Office. And at the stroke of a ministerial pen, international visas go up, international visas go down. The extent to which universities can have international students stay in the country after graduation goes up, it goes down. Nervousness about small boats crossing from France, translating to imperial postgraduates for chemistry being denied visas. We've suddenly denied Chevening scholars from Sudan and Afghanistan, some of the most talented young people in the world. We've denied them of an opportunity of a British education because universities are at the whim of government. And again, if you think that the Home Office visa system is something that you want to take the principle of and extend out further, boy, oh boy, have I got a bridge to sell you. But that is what a graduate tax would do. It would fundamentally lead to universities constantly nagging the Chancellor, wholly ignoring the whims of students. And that to me seems a terrible place to be.
John, do you agree with the Browne review that institutional autonomy would be at risk under a graduate tax model, or is that concern overblown?
I think one of the strongest arguments, as John says, for the current system is that it essentially creates a hypothecated taxation base for higher education. And I think we all have to acknowledge that. I think the problem with saying that that's the reason to stay as we are is that the reason that we can't get hypothecation for anything else or for general taxation is because the Treasury hates it. And just because the Treasury behaves in a particular way doesn't mean we have to accept that forever. Nor indeed should we accept the arbitrary and frankly unfair way the Home Office behaves. These are marks of institutional failure within the state rather than features of life that will just always be there. So yes, it increases the risk of being exposed to them. But as Jonathan's pointed out, it's not as though higher education is not exposed to those risks at the moment. And it's worth saying that the whole reason for introducing fees, go way back to the Deering report in the late 90s, was that it would solve the problem Jonathan just outlined, that higher education is always at the bottom end of a list of priorities, and this would create a flow of continuous money that would enhance the available cash for higher education. But if you track how much money per domestic student higher education had in the late 90s, and you factor that up for inflation, it's exactly the same amount of money that they've got for domestic students now. So 30 years of all of this activity, and we haven't seen a substantial increase. And I think the problem with it is that accepting Jonathan's argument, I can see the political reality of it, which is that it's always easier to give funding to early years or things like that. It doesn't change just because you put the mechanism at a greater distance. It's still the case that the Treasury tries to squeeze down on the amount of money available for higher education. It did that by freezing the domestic undergraduate fee level over time. Even the recent government announcement that it will go up with inflation is time limited. And I think there's no way to escape the fact that fundamentally the underlying source of this cash is going to be the government. The state is the instrument by which we ensure that our higher education system is funded in the way that we need to. And we need to build around that rather than try and build against it. Does that mean that I'm satisfied that the government will get this right all of the time? No, it doesn't. Do I think there needs to be clearer and stronger safeguards within that system than there are now? Absolutely, I do. But I don't think that's a reason not to do it. Institutional autonomy is a matter of live debate even under the current system, which is supposed to be the freest it's ever been. So I think there's no reason to suppose that any alternative system would be automatically better or automatically worse. It's about how you build the constitution of the system, as it were.
I think the difficulty that this debate is exposing is, and again, I don't think this has ever been resolved ever since Deering first introduced fees, 30 odd years ago, is are universities private sector or market-driven institutions? Are they public sector and public-driven, or are they quasi-market? At various points, they are one or other, or indeed all of these institutions. And at the moment, they probably sit closest into a quasi-market system. So student numbers are uncapped, which they are not in many other countries in the world. They are essentially regulated. The fee structure is capped, but it's not fixed. So you can charge different prices, albeit there are reasons why people don't. Course choice and course design is entirely within the remit of a Vice-Chancellor and his or her team. Total growth or total shrinkage is, again, totally at the remit of a Vice-Chancellor and his or her team. So some universities grow, some universities shrink, some have created new campuses, some have closed particular faculties, some have expanded into different areas, different course choices. International students are wholly unregulated, which is one of the reasons why that has grown like Topsy. But at the same time, fundamentally, they can't charge market price because it's capped by loans. They can't have entirely free choice over international students because that's controlled by the Home Office in terms of visas. Research funding entirely comes from the state. It's a very important aspect for every single university, but it's entirely at the gift of UKRI or the other various funding councils. If you sort of park private sector research funding, the vast majority of that comes from the state. John's old employer, the Office for Students, puts a vast amount of conditions on almost everything that a university does. They are regulated for quality, for graduate outcomes. They are regulated for inputs. There are lots of discussions about the level of grades they give. So they operate very oddly in this sort of mix of partly completely unconstrained and partly wholly regulated. And what this argument is about which bits of it you want to make more marketized and less marketized. And those are uncomfortable words, because almost nobody wants to have a more marketized system. Almost nobody, I don't think, really in domestic politics, possibly with the exception of reform, would argue for a wholly uncapped fee system, or indeed a much, much higher fee cap. You could have a world in which you raise the fee cap again to £15,000, £18,000. I think that would have very, very limited political buy-in and indeed public buy-in. When we've polled this, almost everybody wants to see fees drop to £6,000, which is, again, I think, the worst of all worlds, but nevertheless, it is the most politically popular option. So the reason this is fiddly is that what you're not trying to do is you're not trying to shift from one system to another system. You're trying to deal with multiple aspects of the system, which all operate in different ways with different incentives, and all sort of come to a smush together, and people have to work it out how it works.
Yes, it's anything but straightforward. Okay, finally, let's talk about the impact of a graduate tax on students, because unhappiness from students about the student loans is exactly why that's been plastered all over the media for several weeks now. That just shows how important it would be to get them on side for any alternative funding system. And there are definitely some features of a graduate tax that I think could raise a few eyebrows among prospective students. For example, many of them could end up paying back much more than they would have done under a student loan system because, in theory at least, a graduate tax would last for your whole career, not just until you'd paid back the cost of your course. Even the lowest earning graduates would also have to pay a graduate tax, unlike student loans, which are only paid back after you reach a salary threshold of around £25,000 to £30,000, depending on when you graduated. And also, a graduate tax would stop students from being able to pay for their degree up front, as Jonathan was talking about earlier, which they can do under the current system. And of course, international students pay up front as well. John, what do you make of these potential obstacles? Are they surmountable problems, or could they derail a graduate tax before it even gets started?
Well, I think we can be enormously grateful to the current system that it's already implemented almost all of those aspects in the current system as it is, to the point where the alternative would actually be fairer. So as we said right at the very beginning, you've already got students who are in the Plan 2 system are likely to end up paying back much more than they borrowed. The threshold is barely above the London living wage, for example. And of course, with a taxation system, you can calibrate it more finely than that if you particularly wanted to. You wouldn't have to just be on all graduates and all the time, things like that. I mean, there are other ways of doing that. And John already addressed, I think, the upfront fairness or not. I mean, there's a choice there about whether you think that's right and proper. I think fundamentally, for me, the point about a graduate tax is it says that everybody who has benefited from higher education does owe it to pay more for that higher education system to exist than others. So I think the principle that was established very clearly 30 years ago, that there is a level of private gain from higher education to the point where it is appropriate and right that those who have it pay a proportion more for it than those who do not, is fine. But essentially what we've done over the last 30 years is slowly eliminate the government contribution in lots of different ways. So we ended up pushing almost all of the subsidy for government into what's called the RAB charge, which is the amount the government writes off from students who aren't going to pay all that back. And actually the RAB charge is massively reduced by the introduction of Plan 5 loans, which we haven't even really touched on, which don't attract the same level of interest, as in chargeable interest, but they're going to be paying back for 40 years. So they're going to be paying back for most of their lives anyway. I think the one thing that I haven't talked about here, but which I would raise as a potential thrown rock into the pond, and one of the things that might overcome that funding gap piece, is if we are going to move to a graduate tax system in which you say that those who graduate from higher education now ought to be in a position where they are paying some contribution to that system throughout their working lives, and I think that's perfectly justifiable, why shouldn't that also apply to those who've already graduated, such as the three of us here and many others who have already been through this system? And I think there is a real fairness argument for that. I think that's not going to be popular. But the fundamental problem with the system at the moment, and the Treasury Select Committee has bravely decided to set out and try and find a way of working out how to solve this problem without apparently looking at the underlying funding model and saying, well, how could you rebalance the system to be more fair? Well, you can't. If it's got the total number of people it's got in it. If you want it to make more money, you need to charge them more money. The answer is to put more people into the system. And there are generations of graduates who didn't pay their fair share. We were charged less and we therefore borrowed less. And yes, many of us have paid that money off. We have got younger colleagues working with us now who have a materially less advantageous offer made to them. and are going to be paying for this for the rest of their careers, while the rest of us don't. And I think that is a key unfairness. And I think if you unlock that, that begins to solve some of the challenges with the funding model. And before Jonathan says it, I recognise none of this is going to be popular with the public. But the problem, and I think this is much wider than just the higher education funding piece at the moment, since Brexit certainly, both major parties have seemed to thrive in offering to the public fantasies of how the state can be sustained and to deliver what they want to do. And again, I'm not underestimating why that happens. I know why it happens. I know why it's easy to do. But at some point, we are going to have to address that. You cannot keep going into elections with two sides promising to maintain the triple lock forever, never raise anyone's taxes, and also magically improve your services. And the fact is that we know from previous elections, the public don't believe those things either. They may not like the answers that some parties are going to bring to them, but I think if you build the case and you are able to explain why you're doing that, it's not that the British public don't expect to end up paying more as we come out of the last 20 years of extraordinary disruption that we've gone through. It's that they don't believe that the parties of government currently have a sustained or sustainable plan for doing that. And I think one of the reasons they don't believe that is things like the student loan system, where multiple technocratic fiddlings have gone on across time, all of which were designed to make the system fairer, but actually have made the system more unfair and almost completely inexplicable to anyone. You know, the fee isn't really a fee. The loans aren't really loans. The RAB charge isn't really a debt write-off. Look, the whole thing is almost impossible to explain now. And fundamentally, public policy needs to be made for the public. They need to be able to understand it. And that, to me, is one of the major reasons for pursuing the graduate tax option, is that it allows you to explain much more clearly and cleanly what is being contributed, for what reason, and in what ways. Do I think it needs to have proper safeguards around that? Absolutely, yes, I do. But I don't think this system has provided the safeguards for either student well-being or institutional autonomy that it was promised. And I think we could better bake those into a system that is also more productive and easier for people to understand.
There's no dispute at all from me that what was a brilliant and ingenious system, which I was a huge fan of, has become silted up and complicated over time. So we've moved from a world in which under Plan 2 loans, the burden is split roughly 50-50. So the graduate is expected to pay back about 44p in the pound, with the state picking up the rest. The basic premise of the original system was borrow the money up front, you pay it back when you can on a wholly income contingent basis. If you're not working, you don't pay. If you choose to go into a low income career, you pay back less. If you choose to go into a high income career, you pay back more. And at a certain point, the state wipes the balance. That to me is a brilliant system. It's incredibly clever. It's very fair. There is an implicit subsidy from the high to the low. We deliberately choose as a matter of principle to protect low income earners and some people, particularly women who have years out of the labour force. That system is brilliant. And the 44p is basically a 50-50 split. What we now have is a dog's dinner of a system in which, as John correctly says, every single aspect has been tweaked over time, almost all of which puts more and more burden on the graduates. So Plan 5 graduates, who, as John said, are currently studying, are projected to pay back 81p, with 19p being paid back by the state. So there's a huge shift away from a balance between taxpayers and graduates, wholly now onto graduates. And as I say, the interest rate change retrospectively, the change in repayment terms from 30 to 40 years, it's a mess. It does need to be simple. I wholly disagree on retrospective taxation on graduates. I mean, the whole criticism of Plan 2 is that people took out a deal in good faith and government has now changed the goalposts. That's why people are annoyed. If you then apply that unfairness to graduates in their 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, it's exactly the same problem. You've taken out a deal in good faith, you've done your bit, and the state is now retrospectively changing the goalposts. I think that is both morally incorrect, politically completely toxic. I think it is a terrible, terrible idea. And that seems to me another landmine, which any government would do very well to avoid.
OK, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question. The current political debates are very much focused on potential reforms to the student loan system, but it is not impossible that dissatisfaction with student loans and the perception of large debts, as we've talked about, could tip one or more political parties towards a graduate tax sometime soon. So my question is, if a major political party said to you they wanted to introduce a graduate tax, what's the single most important piece of advice you would give them? Jonathan, what would you offer as your most important pearl of wisdom on a graduate tax?
I would say there is a reason why every single politician who has looked at this ultimately backs away from it. Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, Vince Cable, David Willits, the National Union of Students, for heaven's sake, have all looked at a graduate tax and have all walked away from it. There is a reason why not a single country in the world operates a graduate tax system. They either operate a fully funded general taxation system or they offer a fees and loan system. Not a single country in the world does this. That seems to me more than John's just, oh, this is technocratic, we can work it out. Every single person who has ever looked at this starts off in John's world and ends up in my world. That is what I would say to someone.
Thank you, Jonathan. John, what do you think is the single most important message to convey about a graduate tax?
Do not ask John Simons about this idea. No, the student loan system is not its own dysfunction. It is a symptom of the underlying dysfunction of the relationship between the state and higher education, which we have tried to answer successively over the last 30 years by enrolling students, wittingly or not, as the agents of mediation between the state and higher education through the student choice mechanism we've discussed. And that has not worked. So I think the key thing is, for me, and I suppose it's a bit late to say this, is I'm not here dying in the ditch for a graduate tax, but what I want is a system in which fundamentally we rebalance the nexus between state and HE, and we do not do that through the mediation of students. I think graduate tax offers a viable way to do that whilst maintaining that sense of greater graduate contribution than others. I think the key thing is that it will require, whatever is done, will require political courage. But the biggest thing that worries me at the moment is that all political parties are treating higher education as though it is a fundamentally decorative part of the political and economic world, and that if we don't sort this out, it'll be a bit of a bother, but it won't be too much stress. It's not. Our universities employ thousands of people. Our graduates are spread across the economy. For all that the HE system may not do everything we want it to do, and I can write you a list as long as my arm of things I think it could do better and differently, it is an essential sector for Britain, for our economy, for our political economy, and for our society. And it needs serious investment, not just on the symptoms of the dysfunction, but the underlying causes. And if a graduate tax is part of that answer, then so be it. But it is none of that is going to be a total answer. You need to dig into some of the deeper questions that we've touched on today that sit behind it. Graduate tax may emerge as the answer to those things, or it may not. But the real thing is to wrestle with that fundamental underlying challenge of how you build and sustain a functioning sector for the creation, curation, and communication of knowledge in a constitutional democracy.
Thank you, John. And that brings us to the end of this episode. A big thank you to John and Jonathan for talking us through the potential benefits and drawbacks of a graduate tax to fund our higher education system. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.